Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the blog Live with ME/CFS and this channel, and author of the book Finding a New Normal, Living Your Best Life with Chronic Illness. And I'm here today with something a little bit different. Usually my chronic illness videos are either vlogs showing my daily life or are very specific videos about a treatment or diet or something that has helped my son and I with ME/CFS, and we both also have Lyme disease. Today, instead, this video is for a more general audience. I am going to go through some basics about ME/CFS, what it is, how it affects people, and some details about symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment. So this video is for people who are not yet diagnosed, people who may be sick and not know why, and perhaps think that ME/CFS is a possibility, people with long COVID, people who are friends and family of those who have ME/CFS, people who've been recently diagnosed. You get the idea. This is kind of like ME/CFS 101, the basics. So I'm going to go through, in a question and answer format, some commonly asked questions about ME/CFS and answer those for you. So start off with, what is ME/CFS? And I'll get to the name in a moment. It is at its heart an immune disorder, but it is a very complex disease that affects every part of the body. In particular, it has dramatic effects on the neurological, the endocrine, and the immune systems. Because of this, it is sometimes referred to as a neuroendocrine immune disease, or NEID, so you may hear that term as well. It is characterized by a deep exhaustion that is not relieved by rest. Its primary characteristic, and the way it is generally diagnosed, is an intolerance to even mild exertion. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. You can think of it as if the mitochondria in your body were an old battery in a cell phone, where you can't fully charge it. When you do charge it, it runs out really quickly, and you're constantly having to recharge it. I currently have an old battery in my laptop, actually, and it absolutely mirrors the way that I feel most of the time. And I should have mentioned at the start, I'm really not going to talk a whole lot about our own experiences. I will link to an earlier video I made about our own history and experiences with ME/CFS in case you're interested in that. So what are the symptoms of ME/CFS? Well, as I said, it affects every part of the body. So it can cause symptoms everywhere. It is also often different from one person to the next, though there are some similarities. It is generally defined as complete exhaustion. It's not just feeling tired. It is exhaustion that is not relieved or improved by resting. So when a normal person gets tired, even really wiped out after a big weekend or a big day, you go to sleep, and when you wake up the next morning, you feel better, you feel normal again. That doesn't happen with people with ME/CFS. And in fact, that is another hallmark of the disease, impaired sleep, where no matter how many hours you sleep, you don't wake up feeling refreshed. It can also cause cognitive dysfunction, often called brain fog. It can cause a dizziness or lightheadedness or even fainting. And I'll describe that in a little more detail in a moment. But sometimes it's just that you get feeling sicker the longer that you're upright, even sitting like I'm doing right now. In people who have ME/CFS, there are often some sort of immune symptoms. It could be recurring sore throats. That's how I was at the beginning, and both of my sons as well. Swollen swollen lymph nodes, sometimes feeling feverish, even if you don't actually have a fever. Your temperature reads normal, but you feel all shivery and feverish, or feeling achy all over, flu-like aches. And in fact, the whole disease really, especially at the beginning, it feels like you suddenly got a flu, only it doesn't go away. And finally, most importantly, the key characteristic that defines ME/CFS is, as I mentioned earlier, an intolerance to exertion. This means that even mild exertion, like cooking an easy meal or walking out to your mailbox, something really minimal, going to the drugstore, can cause a sudden, severe worsening of all your symptoms. So even if you're having a good day, and some people with ME/CFS, including me, have ups and downs where some days are better than others. Even if you're having a good day, you have some mild exertion, and anywhere from 1 hour to 24 hours, sometimes even 2 days after the exertion, you suddenly feel like you just got the flu, wiped out, maybe sore throat, maybe aches, maybe a headache, brain fog. You just feel completely floored. So we'll get back to that in a moment when we talk about diagnosis. What does the name ME/CFS mean? What does it stand for? Unfortunately, this is a long, tortured history with many disagreements, and it's complicated, but I'll try to keep it simple. The letters ME stand for myalgic encephalomyelitis. What that mouthful means is myalgic means pain, encephalomyelitis means inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, such as would happen with an acute infection. And so together they mean pain and inflammation in the brain and spinal cord that just continue on, that are not relieved when an infection disappears, for instance. The name ME comes from the UK. There is a long history of outbreaks or clusters of ME all over the world, here in the US as well as the UK and everywhere else you can think of. For at least 100 years, there have been documented outbreaks of ME. I'm guessing that's something a lot of people aren't aware of. But one of the first well-documented cases was in the UK at the Royal Free Hospital in 1955. That was where the doctors attending those patients came up with the name. It is thought that Florence Nightingale might have had it based on symptoms that she wrote about. But the outbreaks go back even further, before it had a name, to the 1918 flu pandemic, to 1938 in LA. There's a website with a long, long list of these outbreaks. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So this disease was known as ME in most of the world. And then along came the US, who always has to do things different. In 1984, there was an outbreak of ME in a small town called Incline Village near Lake Tahoe in Nevada. Researchers and clinicians from the CDC went to Incline Village to see what was happening with this group of people who got sick mysteriously and weren't getting better. Unfortunately, they ignored all the past history and decided to rename it. And the name they came up with is a name that has haunted us patients ever since then: chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. The problem with that name is it is very trivializing. It focuses on one single symptom, fatigue, that is common to thousands of other diseases. It does not capture the severity of this very debilitating disease. So CFS happened in 1984, and ever since, doctors and patients alike have hated the name. We've finally gotten to the point where the CDC website does use ME/CFS, and that's where that combined name came from. But we would still like to get rid of the dreaded CFS for good. So what causes ME/CFS? Well, all of those outbreaks certainly point to perhaps some sort of infectious trigger, that a population of people could all be exposed to the same infection and some portion of them develop ME/CFS. And in fact, that has been studied widely. And there have been about a dozen or so specific infections identified that have the ability to trigger ME/CFS. Epstein-Barr virus, which is the virus that causes mono, what we call mono in the US, what's called glandular fever in Europe, that's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. The parvovirus, another very, very common virus. These are viruses that affect almost the whole population. Usually you get parvovirus as a kid, you never even know what it was called. It causes some respiratory symptoms. EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, by the time you're, I think the statistics say 25, something like 98% of the population has Epstein-Barr virus in their system, even if they didn't actually catch and exhibit symptoms of mono or glandular fever. Other triggering infections that have been identified include Q fever, Lyme disease, which, take note, is a bacterial infection, so it's not just viruses. And of course, COVID-19 came along and changed everything for the world of ME/CFS. With all those other infections, infectious triggers that I just mentioned, studies show that roughly 10 to 11% of patients will go on to develop ME/CFS. So of all the people that get mono in a certain year, say, 10% of them won't recover and will instead develop ME/CFS. That number starts out a little higher. They've done specific studies on Epstein-Barr since mono is so prevalent, and found that, like, after 6 months, maybe 20% of people haven't recovered. But at the 1 year point, it's down to about 10%. And that 10 to 11% holds true for all of the infections they've studied, except SARS viruses. When there was a SARS virus in the early 2000s, up around Toronto, they found that about 25% of the people infected by SARS developed ME/CFS, much, much higher than any of the other triggering infections that have been studied. And of course, COVID is a SARS infection, which has led to millions more people becoming chronically, permanently ill with ME/CFS. And I'll talk more about the prevalence in a moment. Before we leave this topic of what causes it, I want to also mention the role that genetics plays, because when they've done family studies, they have found, and there is plenty of anecdotal evidence to support this, even in my own family, that it does tend to run in families. Within both people who are blood related, pointing to genetics, and people who live in the same household but are not blood related, like spouses, which points to that infectious trigger. So putting those pieces together, it is generally understood that certain people have a genetic predisposition to ME/CFS. And then when those people are exposed to a certain kind of trigger, like an infection, they develop it. Whereas someone else who is not genetically predisposed does not. So I didn't know of anyone in my own family with ME/CFS, but I got it in 2002 on March 1st. I'll get back to that in a moment too. And both of my sons developed ME/CFS 2 years later. So when I got it, it was not, I don't think it was an infection. It could have been, but I just suddenly felt like I had the flu and it never went away, as I described. What was going on in my life at the time was we had moved to Delaware. Allergies are awful here, and I had developed seasonal allergies. Well, not all that seasonal because I'm mostly allergic to molds and dust. But I was being treated by an allergist with allergy shots. And the day that my ME/CFS symptoms started, I had just gotten up to the maintenance level with my allergy shots. And for the next few months, as I was trying to figure out what had happened to me, why I was suddenly sick, I had lots of ups and downs, but every time I got an allergy shot, I got a lot worse, which makes sense. This is an immune disorder, and allergy shots are stimulating the immune system. So there are also cases of ME/CFS starting from trauma, for instance, a severe car accident. And I do know of at least one person whose ME/CFS started because of chemotherapy. So he was cured of his cancer, but he ended up with ME/CFS. So there are lots of different triggers, although I think the infectious ones are the most common. I'd also like to point out the difference between an abrupt onset like I had. I can tell you the exact day, March 1st, 2002. I was healthy before that and sick after that. And a lot of people are like that. Roughly 75 to 80% of those with ME/CFS had an abrupt onset, can point to the exact day that the disease started for them. However, the rest of them have what's called a gradual onset, where the symptoms came on gradually. There may have still been some sort of trigger in their past that perhaps didn't fully bring ME/CFS on, but made the symptoms begin more gradually. So, how prevalent is ME/CFS and who gets it? Well, again, COVID changed everything. So, before 2020, there were several excellent population studies done in the US that determined that about 2.2 million people in the US had ME/CFS. Now, since COVID, so when I'm talking about COVID being a trigger, that means that much of what is being called long COVID actually is or develops into ME/CFS. And the naming is very confusing because there are other things that can go along with long COVID that are specific to the COVID infection that don't typically happen in ME/CFS with other triggering infections. Things like microclotting in the lungs, other kinds of lung problems, cardiac issues. These are things that have been found to be a part of long COVID that aren't necessarily a part of ME/CFS. So ME/CFS is both a subset of long COVID, but also long COVID could be a subset of ME/CFS. It's confusing. It's complicated, basically. So now estimates are that more than 9 million people in the US have ME/CFS. And that number is potentially much higher due to the number of people who know they have long COVID but haven't been diagnosed with ME/CFS, which is a shame because there are some treatments for ME/CFS, which I'll get to. Worldwide, there are about 24 million people with ME/CFS now. Again, much higher than it used to be as a result of COVID. Who gets it? Anyone can get it. It's kind of the scary part, and I'm not here to scare you, but it does affect everyone. Everyone from very young children, my youngest son got it when he was only 6 years old, to the very elderly, to everyone in between. Women and men can get it, although women tend to get it at a slightly higher percentage, probably due to hormonal issues. And people in every category you can think of, every race, every ethnicity, every socioeconomic status. ME/CFS has no bias. It affects everyone. Who is more likely to get it? Well, as I said, if you have a family history, if you have other family members who had ME/CFS, and that gets tricky because older family members were probably not accurately diagnosed. If you've had previous signs of immune dysfunction, and this is the case with me, although I didn't know it at the time. And one of the top ME/CFS doctors in the world, he's now retired, but Dr. David Bell, when my son and I went to see him, he explained to me that even people like me who can identify an exact date when my illness started, if they look back, they can see signs of the immune dysfunction beginning. And when he said that to me, I did realize there were things. Developing allergies for the first time in my life in my 30s. I had a case of poison ivy that I could not get rid of. My immune system just wasn't doing its job. It was just on my forearms, but it was so severe. It required 2 rounds of steroids, which suppress the immune system, to finally get rid of it. And I had this, what I now know is kind of an autoimmune reaction to my second pregnancy, where in my last week of pregnancy, my belly just got covered with this horrible, painful, itchy rash. So those were my early signs. You may have signs like that that you're not aware of. I certainly wasn't. And of course, being exposed to infections. But since some of these infections are ones that all of us have in our bloodstream already, it's impossible to completely avoid them. However, I still wear a mask everywhere in public because, yes, I already have ME/CFS, but I'm doing pretty well at the moment, and it absolutely could worsen. And COVID, being such a known serious trigger, could make me permanently worse. I've had COVID twice. The first time it took me 6 months to recover. The second time about 2.5 months, but I was able to take Paxlovid that time. It's a gamble I don't want to take. I'm trying to avoid it. If you see people around wearing masks still, it's probably because they either have ME/CFS or some other immune disorder that leaves them vulnerable. So how is ME/CFS diagnosed? How do you know if you have it? Well, that's the tricky part. Because in great part because of that horrible name, chronic fatigue syndrome, we have not gotten much research money in the last 40 plus years since that outbreak in the US at Incline Village, which should have made this much more understood. Instead, because they called it chronic fatigue syndrome, it also got labels like the yuppie flu, which was ridiculous because poor people got it too. They just probably weren't able to go to the doctors or the specialists. In all that time, the CDC and the NIH gave ME/CFS almost zero research funding. And so we've had to rely on private research, which us patients in large part support, and our families. So research has come a long way, and it is moving pretty rapidly right now, but we've got a long, long backlog to make up for. So there are no diagnostic tests for ME/CFS. There are no certain biomarkers where a doctor could look for a certain marker in your blood or your urine or something like that. We're not there yet. We're getting closer. So how is it diagnosed? Mostly based on the symptoms. As I explained to you earlier, the most important symptom, though, in diagnosis, because lots and lots of diseases can cause fatigue, can cause cognitive dysfunction, can cause different kinds of pain. And getting doctors to understand that flu-like achiness and that it's caused by the immune system, That is a long haul, believe me. I went through like muscle testing and all kinds of things, trying to find out where my aches were coming from. All along, they were coming from my immune system. The symptoms are really important, and especially that intolerance to even mild exertion, because that is what characterizes ME/CFS and sets it apart from almost every other disease. Let's say you suddenly got sick, you have good days and bad days. On one of your good days, you're so relieved to feel good that you go to the grocery store or you take a short walk with a friend. And then the next day, it feels like you just got the worst flu of your life. You can't get out of bed. You can't get up off the couch. That is that intolerance to exertion. The CDC has named it post-exertional malaise. Another winner from the CDC, yes. We call it PEM for short. It's another horrible, trivializing name. This isn't malaise. It is, you are wiped out. If that happens to you, and you may not notice the pattern until somebody tells you about it. But once you know about it, keep some records. I track exertion level on a 1 to 5. I'll link to my tracking video. See if you are seeing that pattern in yourself, where exertion makes you worse. If so, it's almost certainly ME/CFS. And I would refer you to the US ME/CFS Clinician Coalition. I will link to their website down below, and I'm going to mention it again several times because this is a fabulous set of resources. This group is all of the top ME/CFS clinicians in the US that have come together. They work together cooperatively. They each see their own patients, but they keep each other up to date on the latest research. They share information about what works and what doesn't work in their patients. And these doctors are not only working together for the greater good, but have put together this coalition and this website where they've developed and collected some amazing resources to help your doctor to diagnose ME/CFS and to treat it. So definitely look at that website. And I should have mentioned in terms of diagnosis, your doctor should run some tests to rule out other causes. So for instance, low iron can cause fatigue. Hypothyroidism causes fatigue, although that is often a part of ME/CFS. So being diagnosed with one of these other conditions doesn't mean you don't have ME/CFS, but if you're treated for that and still have the same symptoms, then it's ME/CFS. So it is important to rule out other causes. So how is ME/CFS treated? Well, once again, we haven't had the research. There are 0 FDA-approved treatments for this disease. And it is severely debilitating in most patients to the point that we cannot function. We can't go about the normal daily activities that everyone takes for granted. The good news is that there are many effective treatments that are used for other things that can be repurposed for ME/CFS that work very effectively. But the bad news is very few doctors know about these. And that's where places like this channel and my blog come into play, because I provide information that you can share with your doctor. I have some articles I've written that even include scientific references at the bottom that you can give to your doctor to explain certain aspects of the disease, and the ME/CFS Clinician Coalition. So I will refer to that again. It is a great place for diagnostic information as well as treatment information. In general, your best bet on improving your condition with ME/CFS is to focus on some of the root causes behind the symptoms rather than on symptoms. So instead of treating fatigue, you look at what's causing the fatigue. Instead of treating pain, you see where the pain is coming from. Obviously, that is not easy because There's a lot still not known about this disease, but there is 40 years of research behind it that does tell us a lot about it, including many effective ways to treat it. So, for instance, I explained that a key characteristic of ME/CFS is impaired sleep. You can sleep 15 hours a night and wake up feeling just as exhausted as when you went to sleep. And that studies show that's because we're not getting the deep stages of sleep. And that when we do get down to a deep sleep, we snap right out of it and go right back into the lighter stages of sleep. There are other details. The sleep dysfunction studies did not bring up anything obvious, which is why it went poorly understood for so long. But they did finally find some reasons behind our poor sleep. And that means that you can treat it. So in the case of sleep dysfunction in ME/CFS, it's caused by endocrine dysfunction, which means you can treat that at its root. Not by taking sedatives that knock you out, because they won't affect the quality of your sleep. You'll still wake up exhausted, but by correcting the cause where it's happening in the endocrine system. So I've got a video on that. I've got a blog post, an article to share with your doctor. I'll share all of that in the notes below. Similarly, one of the best things you can do for yourself when you have ME/CFS is to get orthostatic intolerance diagnosed and treated. This is a form of dysautonomia, so you may hear it by that name, or that orthostatic intolerance is an umbrella term that encompasses multiple conditions where we can't keep our blood pressure and or heart rate steady when we're upright. Standing especially, but even sitting up like I am right now. I will need a really good nap after this video. And because OI, as it's known, is an integral part of ME/CFS, one study showed that orthostatic hypotension, where the blood pressure drops when we're upright, occurred in 97% of the participants in the study. And POTS, which a lot of people have heard of, that's postural orthopedic tachycardia syndrome, where the heart rate goes up when you're upright, that occurs in about 2/3 of ME/CFS patients. So the orthostatic hypotension or neurally mediated hypotension are actually more common in ME/CFS than POTS, but POTS is diagnosed way more frequently. And I don't understand the reason for this. But again, I've got a video, I've got a blog, lots of blog posts on this topic, on how to diagnose it, which can be tricky, how to treat it, lots and lots of effective treatment options for you to try. So I'll include all of that in the notes below as well. Another example of treating issues at the source, I said that endocrine dysfunction is an integral part of ME/CFS. Well, that means that it's very, very common for people with ME/CFS to have a dysfunctional thyroid. Hypothyroidism, I think, is a little more common, but sometimes hyper too high thyroid is also occurs. So getting not just a screening test, but a full thyroid panel can help pinpoint where you have issues. I've had this disease for 23 years, and I only just recently discovered this was a huge issue for me. And since treating my hypothyroidism, I'm doing so much better. I obviously still have ME/CFS, but I am far more functional and can do more without crashing. That's what we call that after exertion wipeout than I used to be able to. So take a look at my blog, other videos on this channel, and please look at the US ME/CFS Clinician Coalition. I'm going to put that at the top of the links below so that you can find that easily. And finally, can ME/CFS be cured? So it's not a simple answer. Like everything else with this disease, there is no medical cure for it. There is no known way to make someone recover, in large part because we still don't fully understand the mechanism behind it. What causes it to start? What keeps it going? We need to figure those things out before we know how to cure it or even treat it, honestly. However, and this is really important to understand, some people do recover spontaneously, meaning their own immune systems normalize themselves. There are factors that make this more likely. That doctor I mentioned, Dr. David Bell, he was primarily a pediatric specialist. That's why I took my son to him. And he did a study years ago of his former patients. And what he found, some children and some adults, what he found in terms of recovery rate was certain factors made it more likely that a person would spontaneously recover from ME/CFS. Getting it as a child makes recovery more probable. Having ME/CFS that is up and down, good days and bad days, makes it more probable. He saw less recovery in the people who were always just exactly the same. Having an abrupt onset, like I explained earlier, those people had a higher incidence of recovery than those who had a gradual onset. And treating the disease makes it more likely that your body will be able to recover. Besides the other things I mentioned, you can, to some small extent, treat the immune dysfunction and help to, in a small way, normalize your immune system or move it more toward normal. And all of those things help. Without those treatments, this disease will steadily get worse because the sleep dysfunction alone will make you steadily get worse because so many important functions happen in your body while you're sleeping. So if you treat that and improve your sleep, and you treat the orthostatic intolerance so that you're not feeling sick all the time and so that you can be a little more active, and you treat some of the immune dysfunction and the underlying endocrine problems, if you treat these different aspects, there's a greater chance in recovery. Also, studies have shown the greatest chance of recovery is usually in the first 3 to 5 years. There are few instances of recovery after that. However, right in our family, we've got an exception to that. My youngest son, who got ME/CFS when he was 6, was fully recovered by the time he was 16, well beyond the 3-year range. His was always milder than mine and my older son's. We treated his orthostatic intolerance very soon, and that left him functioning about 95% of the way to normal. It really did. We still saw that if he did too much, he would crash. He couldn't have a sleepover on a Saturday night because he wouldn't be recovered in time for school Monday. He could play a soccer game, but he couldn't play 2 soccer games in a row. That would crash him, for a week. Getting a cold could still cause him to crash for a week. So he would still crash, but in between the crashes, he was functioning pretty normally. So that's his story. It is possible to recover. And there are people with mild ME/CFS. We saw it right in our own family. He had that telltale post-exertional malaise, intolerance to exertion. So there is a wide range within ME/CFS, mild to moderate. About 25% of the people with the disease are very, very severe, meaning they are housebound, bedridden, perhaps even hooked up to an IV and a feeding tube. There are quite a few people that are in that situation. So it is a disease to be taken seriously. So I covered a lot of ground here. I hope that helps you to better understand this very poorly understood disease, to support either yourself or your loved ones who may or may not have it, and to better understand what people with ME/CFS are dealing with on a daily basis. I just stuck with the basics here, so I am sure there are questions that I didn't cover. Just let me know in the comments down below, and I will gladly answer your questions.